James, what did Ardclough mean to you when you were started researching the independence, or whole independence scene? And did you see it as players, or are we just another townland in the great scheme of things among the many through the county?
Yeah, well, it's hard to kind of just put Ardclough in it because it's such a big area. It's a surrounding area of Straffan and Selbridge and Kill comes into it as well. Funny enough, I brought over, you might wonder what this is here. It's for British Army recruiting, and when Eoghan asked me to come along, I said I'd have a look and see was there any Ardclough casualties in the First World War, and because we were working on the list with Kildare Local Studies are working on the list of Kildare men who were killed in the First World War, and none from Ardclough turned up. So
we fight quite a few from Straffan, though.
Straffan, Selbridge, and other areas like that. So for recruitment for the British Army was mainly in the bigger areas, the towns and that. Funny enough, there was no work.
The town end of Ardclough is very small, though.
Yeah, if you wanted the exact address, it doesn't pop up at all.
The way I tend to look at this, and I'm very fluid in this, I'd be interested in what Jane Tankard has to say as well. I tend to think of it as the catchment area for the school. And that's obviously very complicated now when they're travelling from Naas to Ardclough to our 16 teacher school. But we had maybe 40 or 50 pupils in our school all those years. So it would have taken a nuclear art. It would have gone to Barnrath. It would have gone to Wheatfield and places like that. The townland of Ardclough. Ardclough is a moving place, by the way. Like if you were to talk about Ardclough originally, it's obviously where the church and the school is, and now it's Tipperstown. And then probably in the old days it was Lyons. Sorry to cut across you there, but I'm just putting a definition on the scale of where we're talking about. But I think it's open-ended. We go all the way to Straffan almost,
recruitment then kind of mainly was centred on the big towns because of unemployment mainly. In the country there was a lot of work because there was a lot of farming activity going on. So the British were always complaining that the farmers' sons were not answering the call to join the army, and it was mostly the ones from urban areas that were getting, because I tend to think that most of the Irishmen that went to fight in the First World War were economic recruits, because to take the King's shilling at the time, there was no other shillings available. So most of them are joining because there's nothing else. They're not joining for King and Country, and they're not fighting for King and Country. They're fighting to put a roof over their head, to put shoes on their feet, clothes on their back, more so than anything else. So in the general rural areas you don't get as much recruitment as you do as in Naas and Newbridge and Attyna because of huge unemployment figures. But as I was saying, Kildare's not really that active in the War of Independence because they're not that well organised. It takes time to organise a revolutionary movement, and it's only really after the death of Tom Ashe that things really start to take off, and that recruitment begins, and that new volunteer companies and Sinn Féin clubs, as they were known then, not Sinn Féin Commons, are formed from 1917 onwards, reorganisation after the Easter Rising, and that's why other places like Straffan and that are late in forming companies, and Naas would have had one, Newbridge would have had one earlier, and Kill would have had one. A lot of it is to do with personalities. It's personalities that kind of run the revolution. You see it in Tipperary, and you see it in Kerry, and you see it in different areas in Dublin. And in Kildare we tend not to have that many revolutionary personalities, but we do have the few like Devoy and Jim Dunn and that, and then Harris and a few others. And then in Straffan you have in Selbridge you have a good few. You have Cardwells, and you have I can't think of them all now, but Cornelia then in Straffan is probably one of the main ones. So most of these groups or companies centre around a personality like Michael O'Kelly in Naas, happens to be the president of Sinn Féin in Naas. He happens to be the officer of command in Naas Company of the Irish Volunteers, latterly then the IRA, and he's also editor of the Leinster Leader. So a man like that can influence an awful lot of people in many indirect ways. And it's only through 1921 that Kildare begins to become organised, and it's, as Eoghan said, it's the company ambush because you have a North Kildare flying column operating. You have Jim Dunn, and he's coming of age at that stage, and he's getting more active. And the Kill area is very active as well. Round Naas is active. But places like Newbridge and the Corry and that are under fierce pressure because you have military barracks in all the areas in Naas, Kildare, Newbridge and Corry. There are around 10,000 British troops within County Kildare.
You mentioned Tom Ashe as an important personality rallying in Kildare and the whole, because that there was train, there was convoys came from every small parishes to. What was the family memory part of Tom Ashe? It must be difficult to get a grasp of what he was really like when somebody is so iconic and so talked about through the country and such a big figure.
Well, I suppose from our point of view, and Brother Tom and Mark and my cousin are both here, and they'll remember it quite well. When we were young, I suppose our family originally came to Straffan in 1928, came from Kerry.
Very close after, yeah.
Yes, and our abiding memory, or my abiding memory, would always be of Thomas Ashe's sister Nora, and she was a regular visitor to our home in Straffan, as was Tom's brother Gregory. And we many occasions sat down at our fireplaces and listened to their stories about that particular time. But there weren't too much details about what the stories were. There was not too much detail about the man himself, what he was. I think at that particular point in time, history had already told the story of who he was and what he stood for and what he died for. And but it was more about the family history and traditions and their upbringing from a very humble and small beginning back in Kinnaird and Kerry, from a very small family farm. That out of a little small area of Ireland, that a man, part of their family, could achieve so much in a short number of years. He was 32 years of age when he died. And we've spent the last probably year and a half travelling around at various commemorations, which is fantastic to be part of and to see. And I'm learning more as I go along through all of these things. Through James and Jimmy had a function in Celbridge where there was a bit about the history there. Jimmy did another one up in Dublin that I was at with the 1916 Relatives Association. And at all the time you're meeting more and more people and you're picking up more and more information. And I suppose, when you look at where he got to, and if you got to remember 100 years ago, there wasn't an awful lot of communication available. Like no mobile phones, no emails, no fax, WhatsApp. They were not available. And their mode of travelling was, he had a motorbike at the time. He was living out in North Dublin. But outside of that, it was very, very limited. And yet, I've travelled around the country like Martin and Tom have, and you go to Kinnaird, you go to Dingle, you go to De La Salle College where he went to school there. You go out to North Dublin, Carduff and Lusk where he taught out there, where he set up the Black Raven Pipe Band, where he set up the football club out in Lusk. You go from there then to Ballinallee in Longford. You mentioned sedition there in your speech. That's where his downfall was, or the cause of his downfall, where he was arrested there for a seditious speech. You go to Newtown Castle in Longford, and the abiding memory of going to all those places is just to see the local people who still have a kindred spirit and a love of the man and what he stood for and the way that they remember him. And that from my part would be as important as what we as a family think.
What did you learn? What surprised you most of the things you found in the year and a half since the commemorations began?
As I said, it's more the local communities where he was involved in, and the relationship that he had with that. There's the old Fenian IRA out in Swords and Fingal and that area out there, and they've kept the memory alive through Ashbourne and the Cross in Ashbourne with their commemoration every year. The GA Club in Lusk have kept his memory alive because he was a founding member of it. The Black Raven Pipe Band have kept his memory alive. It's amazing, how the memory has been kept alive. And even go to Ballinallee in Longford, which is the home of Sean McKeown, the blacksmith of Ballinallee. He still stands in good stature in that community where a local man is still a national figure, And to be down there and to be so welcomed by people down there is the amazing part as far as I was concerned. And you know, one of the things that, you know, rather than me rambling on too much, you know, as regards what the man is, that's his book here. And as I said, Jim and James are better historians and far better historians than I, but that's the book by Micheál Moran. I can leave that with you, Owen, if anybody wishes to have a read of it and let that. Yeah. That's more about his story. But just a little story, if I can, and rather than taking up too much of your time. In all families, one other thing that I should mention there, you mentioned about the Youngs in Selbridge. Yeah. We're related to the Youngs through marriage, through my uncle Sean in Rathmore. His wife was Clodagh Young from there. So like there's bits of connections in lots of areas that you come across.
And he was also your family. Your father was a brother, was that right, of Thomas? What exactly is
he was my granduncle. Thomas Ashe, our granduncle. Okay. So he's my father's uncle.
Your father's uncle.
Yeah.
And your father was instrumental in setting up the Ardclough Common of Fianna
No, that would be his brother Sean. That I mentioned. That would have been related to the Youngs, or married through marriage. Yes. Right, okay. And he lived in Rathmore.
Okay.
And he was the, what was we call him, Martin? Maybe more the black sheep of the family. The fact that he was some of the things that we heard him talk about.
My father used to say.
He was the gun runner.
My father used to say, "That fella tell you he could make hay on Christmas Day."
And you probably could.
Can I just say something?
Yeah, of course, Martin. Yeah. We're privileged to have three items.
You asked the question, like, you know, what do we remember? And you know, we've remembered, as Padraig said, we very little, but we were up in Ashbourne, and Liz Bruton was talking, and she says, families, lots of families, so much hurt in the families, that very little was said, you know, locally, about what went on, and of course Padraig is alluded to a lot of stuff maybe we knew, but I suppose the other thing I'd like to say is, when you say, what do we think about it, what we know now, you know, what we fascinated, like, we grew up in the 60s, and travelling was, you know, to get to Ardclough was a big deal. And what Thomas Ashe did, he was in America. He was all the places Padraig mentioned around the country. He was loved, as Padraig mentioned, in these places. You know, how he got around and how these people could get around. Padraig Pearse, you know, Michael Collins and all these people.
And dead at 32.
Yeah, the fabulous people, and they were all very young, and you know, people are only starting nowadays in their 30s, and they ended their lives in their 30s.
Anything to add there, Tom? What did you learn?
All I can remember is in the 50s there was Sean Ashe, father, John Welch in Stratton. They raided a driver from Ballymore. They raided a magazine book in the park in the 50s, and they got all the rifles out there, and they brought them down to the wall of the Cato, hid them there for a while, and then shipped them on to wherever they were going.
Christmas Day, am I right?
Yeah.
Christmas Day.
Yeah.
Magazine.
Yeah.
And Jim Dunn had the 1950s connection as well, hadn't he? He was still. Sorry, I couldn't cross you anyway.
Well, the story I liked about Tom Ashe was that when he was arrested,
PJ, we're going to be in
and he was actually brought to the Corry camp, that Michael Collins actually comes down to the Corry camp to visit him, calls in to see how he is, and at this stage nobody, not even anyone in British intelligence, knew anything about Michael Collins or even knew who he was. He wasn't even a big figure. But he comes down on the train to the Corry camp to visit Tom Ashe while he's in his jail cell, and he gets a mention in the Leinster Leader and the Nationals that Mr. Michael Collins of Irish National Aid has visited Tom Ashe in prison and that. So just the stature of Tom Ashe, that Michael Collins would come all the way down, risk, you know, himself to visit this man in a jail in the most heavily militarised camp in all of Ireland, and is able to visit, get his name on the paper, and then get back to Dublin.
I suppose just one other thing to that is, like, when you're talking about Michael Collins and that, I was at a function with the De Valera's, the Fianna Fáil thing, and one of the things the De Valera families would be very aware of is that, you know, without the influence of Thomas Ashe at the speech down in Clare, he may not have been elected. You know, that he had he was the keynote speaker at that time for his election down there. So you see what history has done where Emma De Valera is concerned, and the family will be very well aware that Tom Ashe was the one that they all wanted to go and hear at that particular time, and that was his status at the time. You know, and again, you've seen, I'm sure, and most people may have seen the funeral imagery that's available there from Michelle that have that. Like, it's colossal, the size of the funeral at that particular point in time in Dublin. And I suppose one of the questions that was asked one night is because why was the speech at the graveside so short? And the main reason for it, and this came from Norah Ashe and came from Gregory's daughter Eileen when I spoke with her about it, was that it took the cortege so long to get to the grave that they were waiting in the graveyard over an hour and a half. And Thomas Ashe's father wanted to see his son being buried in the grave, and he was a very elderly man at this particular point in time. So when it came to time of the speech, Collins was the one decided that it was going to be short and sweet. And it's remarkable that that's such a... No, I don't have the exact words, but you can go through the book and read them out. But it's such a meaningful speech, and it's such an iconic speech. So short and yet so meaningful. It's an amazing piece of footage. If anybody wants to see it, it's well worth looking at.
PJ, I bring you in at length, and I'm sorry it took so long to come.
I
You have a few personalities to talk about. I'll leave it to yourself to introduce which first.
I'm at a loss here that I'm afraid I can't recall personal memories, so you'll have to appreciate it there for that I'm talking about.
Well, that doesn't matter. It's how it's passed through the family, and George's family is
I
important.
apologise for the fact that she's indisposed because of this flu bug and all the rest of it. But before we go off Tom Ashe, there's just one thing I want to say to you, that Pearse O'Hanlon has a photograph of Tom Ashe laid out in the mansion house, and the common honour or a guard of honour at the top, and the two people standing at the top at each side. One is Anya O'Hanlon, and the other is Padraig Ashe.
Oh.
Now I'm here therefore to represent the family of Micheál O'Hanlon on the 16th. This one, the series of 16, so if anyone wants to read about Micheál O'Hanlon, this is written by Padraig as one of the 16 series, and it gives a very good account of all his background. So that's O'Hanraháins, who was on my Deirdre's mother's side. Deirdre's mother was Margaret Mary O'Hanlon, and Margaret Mary O'Hanlon was the daughter of Edward O'Hanlon, a brother of Micheál and Henry O'Hanlon. And then fortunately, I have none of these associations. I'm afraid I have to dig very deep, James. But on our father's side, then, this is the book on the O'Kelly brothers that James mentioned, both editors of the Leinster Leader, the only two brothers in Ireland to be successive editors of the Leinster Leader from 1906 until 1922.
Yeah.
And this book was produced by the Naas local history club, co-authored by James Dorney and Ian Kenny last year as a memorial of that. So then is the relationship that and this is the man that was executed in 1916, and there's still a mystery as to know why he was executed. Because Micheál O'Hanlon was not an army man in the strict sense of the word. He wasn't, in other words, a shooter in that sense, but he was a very good organizer. And the history of the Hannracháin family starts back in 1798 in Vinegar Hill, because his father, and I get a bit emotional about this because it's very close. And Vinegar Hill in Wexford is what Martin Luther King was in America, a seminal moment in his history. So when I report myself, I shouldn't do these things because when you get emotionally involved, that's what happens. But anyway, his father therefore was in Vinegar Hill, Father Murphy. His son Richard, who was the father of the Hanlon brothers, born in 1846 in Wexford, had a most unusual occupation, a cork cutter. Worked in Cherry Brewery cutting corks, and had the distinction of having on his census form master cork cutter. Now I say, if you ask someone in the quiz now, what is a master cork cutter? I'd say you would have difficulty finding an answer to it. But anyway, that's where he started off as a Cork cutter. Now, in 1867, in the uprising in Wexford, he was also involved. And as a result, Wexford being a garrison town, he was being hounded by the British military. So in the 1870s, he left Wexford and moved to live in New Ross. And in New Ross, three sons were born. Henry in 1875, Micheál on the 17th of January 1877, and Edward in 1899. And they lived in New Ross, and he worked in Cherry's Brewery and married a lady by the name of Mary Williams, who was a well-known family still in Wexford in Timon. The Williams of Timon would make more bread in Ireland than anyone has made over past times. It is now owned by Dunn Stores, I believe. But that was the family. That was the Williams family. And the reason he married her was that he met her brother, John, who was an accountant in the Cherry's Brewery. So they married in New Ross and had the three sons. And then in 1880, they moved to join Corcoran's mill and water factory in Carlow. And he took up the job there and the family all moved to Carlow and lived in 1991 Tulloch Street in Carlow, which at that time was the main trade street. We'll be down there last year for reconfiguration of it, and it's amazing to think about it. On that street, every trade you could think of as a business. And talking about life in Ireland today, all the people traded downstairs and lived upstairs. There was living over the shop. It was an amazing society. And in that town, Micheál went to the Christian Brothers and Harry and Edmund, and then went to the College Academy. And in the records of the College Academy back in 1985, you'll find still there where they signed on for their courses. Now, in late 1890s, at that time obviously, Carlow is a garrison town. It's a very much a unionist population, therefore it's not nationalist. Michael and Henry, we call him Harry, were very interested in Irish language. And that time no Irish language had been taught in the school. But that time a priest by the name of Father Dorney had produced a book called Simple Steps in Ireland, in Irish, which was reproduced in the weekly Freeman's Journal and then afterwards produced by Gill and McGill at that time as a book. And from that they became proficient in Gaelic. And then they founded a branch of the Gaelic League and travelled to Dublin to meet Arthur, what's his name? James, the man that started the Gaelic League. You have to go for the notes. I have to go for the notes.
Arthur Griffith?
Arthur Griffith, no.
Hughes.
No,
Owen McNeill.
Pardon?
Owen McNeill was involved.
The Gaelic League.
Don't worry, continue on anyway.
Come on.
Jimmy, you should know.
Owen McNeill.
No, the founder of the Gaelic League.
Gaelic
No, Gaelic League, that's what I'm talking about.
No, it's wait now, hold on now.
Continue on.
Anyway, they went, and but
Yeah, Douglas Hyde.
Douglas Hyde.
Douglas Hyde.
I said that.
I know that.
I said that Douglas Dehida, and you closed it.
anyway, as it turns out, Michael was a most unusual candidate because at that time that was a collection of sort of literary people in Dublin who were from a certain scholarly background. You know, they were into the language and so on and so forth. He was coming from a totally different background in Carlow, so he was sort of a totally different person that stood out. But he had a keen interest in Gaelic and Gaelic affairs, and as a consequence, he became a teacher of Irish. Because at that time they were trying to mobilise and they were trying to get the National Board of Education to put Irish on the agenda for the school, because at that time it was all British, it was British administration. So, and they succeeded in getting the local district council. Now, I don't want to go on too long.
No, but your point is very valid. It was through the Irish language that he came into contact.
That's right, yeah.
He ended up, why was he executed? What's your
This is not
own
important.
theory?
How much time do you want to give me? That's what
I don't want to cut anyone off tonight. There's a conversation out there, the way, yeah.
No, but I mean, that's what I'm saying. I can short I'm only starting as part of past time.
So I mean, I haven't left. I'm still in Carlow in
Yeah.
1990.
We'll try and
We have to
move
get to
the
1916. You see.
because I want to bring James back in again, but
Okay,
continue
well,
on there.
But
Yeah.
then I'll try to speed
On
up.
the Irish language issue. Yeah.
This is why it was that is what we brought him into contact with all these people in Dublin subsequently that we mentioned up here through the KDP, through the Irish language. As well as that, they were very socially orientated people. Like at that time in Carlow, as I say, it was a very upmarket town. And then you had the sort of tradespeople who were down and out. They founded a workman's club, which is still in Tulloch Street in Carlow, which was a meeting place for young working people, but not a drinking club, just a meeting place where they could meet, talk, socialise, a library and so on and so forth. And that's still there today. And if you go down there today, you still see it. And over the door you see the plaque, and inside you see two big photographs of Henry and hAnnracháin on the wall, recognizing that fact. So they were most unusual in that their background obviously came from the Republican nationalist viewpoint of the family. And I think, thinking about it, the reason why they were so, let's say, enamored by it was that they were working from home, because the cork cutter worked in his own house, and he cut the corks in his own house. So in the census in 1901, you'll find Henry and Micheál are mentioned are down as cork cutters. The two girls are stationaries, and Eoghan is in our school. So in other words, they're working together there, and they're talking about national affairs. So I think this is where the whole love of the affairs came from.
In the absence of Sean Harris, James, Tom Harris, it was through Irish classes and contact with Sean O'Connor that brought him into the movement. Was that normal? Was that how a lot of these revolutionaries made their contact?
Yeah, a lot
Those
of
Irish language classes?
Yeah, and then a lot of them were recruited into Irish Republican Brotherhood, who
Yes.
were the organisers, the main organisers who were going around the country organising. And that's what Tom Harris does. He begins to organise in County Kildare. He goes to Prosperous and forms a company in Prosperous. He's involved in organising the IRA, or the Irish Volunteers as they were at that time, in County Kildare. And mostly it's, again, what I was talking about was personalities, that people who have a big influence can influence more people to do more work than that.
And you spend more hours than anyone on this subject. Who was the key personality? Who was the charismatic individual that got Kildare moving? Because Kildare was, as you said, garrison county.
It's hard to pinpoint the key personality. Michael O'Kelly would probably be one of them.
Okay.
Tom Harris, of course, would be another.
O'Brien.
Donald O'Buckle as well, Patrick Colgan.
Yeah, thank
You know,
you.
in every kind of area you have a few. In Kilcock you have the O'Keefes. If you look at any general area, you have a couple of core individuals that kind of form and are elected then officer commanding, because companies, volunteer companies were quite democratic. You were elected by the members. So the personality that was kind of the strongest, say O'Buckle in Minute is probably the strongest personality, and other historians would argue whether he was actually the commander or whether it was Patrick Colgan, which of them was in command. So it kind of centres mainly around like Jim Dunn in Kill. And don't forget that in 1916 Jim Dunn was only 15 or 16 or something like that. By the 20s he's in his 20s, and by the time of the Civil War he's a veteran revolutionary, he's a veteran volunteer, and it's this which drives the Civil War in Kildare more so than the War of Independence. Because only in around April 1921 the IRA begins to form itself into a cohesive army, and to have a brigade and divisional structure. And it's then that Kildare is complemented by Mulcahy, of course, who says that, you know, things are beginning to sort itself out in Kildare. And not only Kildare, but places like Carlow and Laois and Offaly, and counties that were quiet. Some of them were quite quiet at the time. They're not. It's not like Tipperary, it's not like Cork, it's not like Kerry, and Dublin, of course, is the centre of the revolution. If you can't hold the capital of the country, you know, the rest is pointless. So the idea is that Dublin is number one. One of the reasons why they don't want flying columns operating around County Kildare is that it will break the communications link with the south, and the south is the key, and Dublin is the key as well, and the west, but they all converge in Kildare. So if you have all your roads. If you have massive British troops operating around Kildare, it stops communications going to the west and going to the south, which is one of the reasons why Jim Dunn was told not to form a flying column in the area, because it would be against what they were aiming to do. So by the time the Civil War comes around, most of the units in Kildare are quite cohesive, and it's that drives the Civil War. That's why the Civil War is bloodier in Kildare than the War of Independence. It's bloodier in Laois, it's bloodier in Offaly, it's bloodier in all these places, bloodier in Kerry that as well, because Kerry has finally come together as well. So it's bloodier everywhere because at this stage it's more militarised.
Jim Tancred, if you don't mind me bringing you in, the Barnwell Homestead, what was the local memory of the Barnwells and their involvement? They were involved in the Republican movement, but more essentially the Civil War.
Yes, and they were married into the O'Connors in Edinburgh.
Yeah. There's a thread here, isn't there?
Yeah. And they were married into the Saws of North County Dublin, who again were involved in they had the farm leased from Corry's, and they reckoned that they put in a big campaign to have the acreage from Corry where it is but they were there. They were one of them was a great music teacher. My mother remembers her. It was a big thing that said she got her cap and gown, of course, which was a big thing that time. It was a coincidence then that Colbert should come to him after.
It wasn't a family connection.
A brother of Colbert.
Yeah. And when did people talk about it, the comings and goings from the household? Because that was
again, it wasn't. No.
Never mentioned.
Most people would be kind of just stay quiet. Yeah. It's only latter years that question. Poor Sean Meany, before he died, I talked to him one time, and he remembers the Barnwells there. A branch of them went to live in Maynooth, and I think there's still some of them around now.
Was there a secret passage in the house?
Well, there's a little room upstairs, yes, and a tiny little window that when they were, I know when they would hide them up in there, and then again the others in the front door trying to chase them, they could get them out the little window. It's to the side there of where it's across her off and shoulders to me.
And Pauline, anything to add? I remember your father said, would have past hand-me-down memories because of the town activity, the town wars, and what the convoys of trucks coming through the area.
Well, the only memory, I suppose, what was discussed was when my grandfather, Tom Gore, when he was young and he was going to a game of cards during, it would have been at the time the Black and Tans were here, and he was going out to a game of cards, and at that time he was on his bicycle and he heard the rumble of the truck, so it meant that it was only the Black and Tans, nobody else had any transport or whatever. So it was at the bridge in Ardclough that he heard the noise, and he got under the bridge and put his bicycle down under the water in the canal and waited until they were going to cross over, and that he'd have safe passage to go on home, and they decided to stop on the bridge and have a smoke. He stayed in the water for a while anyway, and so that's our only claim to fame. Anyway, after that they moved on, and that's what we say to
Jimmy, you're an expert on the company, really. There's a great story that one of the trophies that the British, the Black and Tans produced after the Battle of Stacundy was the captured cars, some of the cars that were there, but also a bicycle. It turned out to be the postman's bicycle, because the postman McGann had arrived when the house had been captured, had been taken over by the IRA, and of course he couldn't be let go again in case he'd alerted anyone, so he was held in the house as well. And the army then came and took his bicycle to add to the indignity of it. Stacundy, was it a failure? Was it a success? What sort of an operation was it in your knowledgeable eye?
Me?
Yeah.
Well, I think the fact that they all got away afterwards, as you said, it was only one injury. Somebody got And they all got the whole way back to Dunboyne, the cross rivers and the cross fields and everything on the way.
And the officer commander, by the way, this is Sean Boylan, the great Meath manager. His father was the officer commander, but he wasn't allowed to participate. He was too valuable to be allowed to participate. Was that the theory Michael Collins had?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, you've got across it.
Yeah. No, look, I'm not terribly familiar with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm
Okay.
only doing a bit of study on that now.
Yeah, be careful when you come to talks here. You may call it.
I know a fair bit about Baldon, really.
Yeah.
You want to answer that question?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, well, I have to
You mean on Michael Kelly, by the way, I haven't spoken enough of him.
Because that's the other side. No, and again, the Kellys are a similar background. They're coming from Loch Bay, where the young Kellys mills in Leitrim. It was a multi-provisionary mill that provided feed for the people in the locality. And in Hannracháin, that time, in the uprising, they franchised from there. And as a consequence, therefore, they became very nationalistic and went back to live in Loch Bay. And obviously, Nia Hall and Seamus became very, I'd say, nationalistic at that stage, that issue. So that they subsequently, the mother died and they moved to Naas. Now, it's interesting that Seamus O'Kelly was the youngest editor of the newspaper in Skibbereen Neil in 1902.
Yeah.
He then came to Naas in 1906 and he stayed there in 1916 and went to the Heart of Bill in Dublin. Then Michael, his brother, took over then in 1906. Now, they were both therefore journalists, so therefore they were very good people at the pen, at writing, and on all their editorials, which is introduced in the history and has been written in the local paper, just about that. It's interesting that both Michael was a very active Republican, while Seamus was more of a passive Republican, in the sense that he talked about things, and also he was a writer, so he spent a lot of time obviously writing his books. But again he was in the literary sort of nationalistic cycle, so the whole thing was from the together. Now in that scenario, in 1903, when they moved to Dublin, came Deirdre's father, because Deirdre's father was married to Seamus's sister, and she went back to America to join her husband, and the baby was left at home, and therefore the baby was adopted more or less by the Kelly family and came to Naas in 1903 to live with Seamus in the Canal Cottage, which is on the canal where he wrote a lot of his books subsequently. Now, as a consequence, therefore, her father was very actively involved in all this thing in Naas, and is mentioned in dispatches in the context of when Sinn Féin were giving out free potatoes, or potatoes at a special price, they were brought before the court in Naas, and he was released because he was underage. He also was involved in when Ardclough was coming down to talk with the Sinn Féin organised. He was on loan at that stage, and he was coming to speak in Naas at the volunteer meeting, and then Deirdre's father cycled on the bike from Naas out to Elmhall to tell him that he was going to be captured, because for some reason they had some sort of intelligence there between Sergeant Barr in the RAC barracks and by getting information from him. So that was the extent of the involvement in the local affairs that were at that stage. So it's both of those families were involved, but both from different angles.
You can almost tell Michael Kelly's writing skills, because in the Bureau of Military Archive is one of the most interesting. And the story, we won't have time to go into it tonight, but go into the Bureau of Military History to hear the story of how Sinn Féin started selling potatoes in Naas and got brought in front of the local tribunal for selling them with the local traders all giving out, because they're underpricing the local traders as well as bringing across their political message. It's all online and all very accessible. And you want to come in on Arthur Connor? You were involved in a project to commemorate him last year, wasn't it?
Yeah, we applied to the Heritage Officer of the Lawler for put up a heritage sign at Elmhall at Ardclough.
Fabulous,
And
yeah.
it's a fabulous, everybody wants to come and look at it. It's really, really impressive. On one side we have got Ardclough Connor and there is a backstory, and on the other side we have John Will Baker.
Yes.
John Will Baker, I don't know whether you've heard about it.
The very first factory in Ireland, apparently.
Yeah, it was way back in 1800s, 1760s. He was an experimental farmer and he would receive grants from the RDS. He was very well known at the time. He was trying to implement new ways of agriculture, and we had a workshop there to educate young boys and making farm implements and all that kind of thing. So it was lovely. The Heritage Song is lovely. So every year we organise one talk during Heritage Week. And last year, Jim, you were going to talk?
Last year,
Yeah, and then we had Jane, who was it? Mabel Reid gave a talk on Moonbay. Yeah, and this year we hope to give a talk on the weather. Which will be about
something close to all our hearts.
the summer of 1946.
Oh yeah.
And the winter of 1947. So that'll be on the Wednesday of Heritage Week down at Ellen Hall.
Yeah, the memories of winter recently. Yeah. The 1946, the hay was the harvest. There was a Save the Harvest emergency. Jerry O'Gorman's colleagues in the army were all sent out to save the hay, and this is how important it was in Irish life. They actually postponed the All Ireland final so that people, say between Kerry and Roscommon, so that people would actually be able to save the harvest. I'm going to wrap up, and if there's anyone who wants to contribute, come on in. Yeah, no, I'm going to get all three of you to make a little contribution here, and I'm also. Jane, what's next? You've done. We've quite a few in the decade of commemorations. So, what big projects have you coming down the tracks now for us? Because you are the central historian of this centenary business for Kildare.
This year we have, of course, the Great Flu.
We'll be having a talk on that.
Well, as the keynote speaker at the Great Flu seminar in October. It hasn't been completely finalised yet, but it will be the Federation of History Groups. We'll be holding a seminar. And
I cut across you to make this really important point. Central to that keynote speech is the memory of Tommy Christian from Boston.
That's right. I remember Jim Wood as well.
Yeah, Jim Wood. He said the flu closed Ardclough School twice, and they were afraid the third time it would actually wipe them all out altogether. But anyway,
he was on the television. He was excellent on the television.
Anyway, sorry, back to you, Jim.
And then, of course, we have the end of the war commemoration for the end of the war in November, which will be there's a plaque being unveiled in North Kildare for that, and also a publication that we've been working on for the last couple of years. Myself, Mario Corrigan, and Carol Kiley will be a definitive account of Kildare war casualties. That's 2018. Then we're into the War of Independence, the first all then in January, which I think is more important. I think it's probably the most important date. 1919 is the Declaration of Independence. I think it's more important than the Easter Rising and the proclamation. And I think if Ireland was looking for a national day of commemoration, this should be it. This should be our 4th of July. January 21st, 1919. Where we actually declare, and the electorate vote for Sinn Féin overwhelmingly. So from then on, then you're into the War of Independence and that, and
which was the same day, wasn't it?
Yeah, it starts the same day in Eoghan in County Tipperary. Personally, myself, I'm working on a book about a biographical account of everybody in County Kildare who took part in the revolutionary period from 1916 to 1924 on all sides, and then you will see who took what side when the treaty came, whether it was anti-treaty or pro-treaty, and it's a little biography of each individual, men and women, who took part in it. I'm working on that for years and years, so hopefully it'll be out for 2022. If not, it'll be out for 2024.
I'm going to keep pumping in there but you actually made an enormous point in your 1916 history, Kildare 1916, that some of our Kildare casualties were on the other side. We had we had Kildare men who died in British Army uniforms.
British Army uniform, we had Kildare, and women that were civilians. We had Kildare IRA volunteers, and that's the whole idea of the decade of commemorations, is that it's all sides are getting fair down to the coin as such. I'm also working on a book about the Rath internment camp, the Corry internment camps from 1921, which will be released next year, and it lists everyone that was interned in the Corry in 1921 from every part of the country, including Kildare, and At the moment, it's there was a big tunnel escape in September 1921, and that's what I'm actually working on now at the moment. Which is, if anybody has any information, you can contact me. If you don't have my number, you can contact the phone, and we'll send on maybe photographs or any information.
Padraig, will I give you a question, or do you want to say?
No, I'll give you a little story.
Yeah,
Okay,
please,
more than
please,
anything else.
please.
And you know, you saw see what's going on here tonight. So much history involved, and there's great stories and things like that. And you know, the one thing that we all love to have is little bits of the past and little memorabilia and things like that. And in our family, unfortunately, we had a little black sheep who decided that he was going to sell some of the memorabilia for his pound of gold, and unfortunately these things happen. Like we've a lot of different things of memorabilia, his Thomas Ashe's bagpipes, which are on display down in the museum in Dingle, and various other pieces that we've given around to various people that on request, and some with the state. But this particular relation of ours, he's, as far as we're concerned anyhow, his mother outwitted him, because
Mothers always do.
Mothers always do, yes. Our aunt and her husband and herself are both buried in the graveyard in Straffan. But I made a presentation on Thomas Ashe for an old French up in Mulla, in the museum up there, about maybe a year and a half ago. And there was a big crowd at that, and out of that crowd there was a couple in it, and they attended another function I attended there recently there in the offices of the Kildare, or Meath County Council in Ashbourne, where I did a little talk, and afterwards they came to me and said they wanted to have a chat, and I stood with them for a few minutes, and my son Kieran was with me at the time, and the gentleman came back in from his car, and he had these 2 big plastic bags with him, and he said there's a story about all these, and he said that he was very friendly with my aunt. He was a school teacher in Drumcondrat, himself and his wife, and she was a regular visitor to their home. And every occasion she used to arrive up, she'd always bring some more bits and pieces of paraphernalia. And he kept them for all those years. And having met me at Ashbourne, he handed them back to the Ashe family, which was a great story. Now, what I'll just show you on so you can see them. That's one of Thomas Ashe's original books from when he was in school in De La Salle in Waterford. And you can see, look, you can just have a look at there, maybe James yourself. You can see the detail and the scripting that's in it.
It is amazing.
It is amazing. If anybody wants to have a look at it, by all means, you're more than welcome to have a look.
Can I just say to you something there?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
I interviewed somebody who just passed away. She was Sister Corry in Eoghan. She was placed in a school Katrina, where Laurie and
That's
would have gone to school.
Martin's sisters.
Yeah. And I interviewed her, and she said she went to Scullawera. That's where she went to school.
Okay.
And this is where
Nora
would have
taught, yes.
She said she would have had her, I think, possibly in her class. She said she was the most inspiring woman that she ever came. She said she was a young girl herself, but she said she never forgot the presence that Nora would have had.
Yeah.
And she never forgot her. Now, Sister Corry was only after passing away the last 2 weeks.
Okay.
I interviewed her about a year and a half ago. But that was one of the things she said in the interview, just to let you know.
Yeah,
that,
thank you.
know,
Well, that's, if you've mentioned earlier, James, and yourself, you know, the place that the Irish language and those take part. Like Nora set up the first Irish-speaking school in Dublin.
Wow.
So that's for her part. But just a few of the other bits and pieces that you have. You can see that yourself. These are original telegrams going back to that time of 1916 when that was to Nora. That's from Michael Collins.
A telegram from Michael Collins.
Yeah, and there's a second one. They're fairly delicate now, so again, it just
can't hand them out, but we will.
no, they're there to if anybody wants to have a look at them, you know.
Tom just removed from the Mater Hospital. The hall. That's amazing. That's from down to your father, to Tom's father, is it?
Yes.
Yeah, with naturally.
That's just more of an interesting one, I suppose, from the point of view as regards what it's for.
To be drawn for on the 30th of December 1920, a magnificent life-size portrait in oils of the late Tom Ashe, in massive gold frame. And many numbers will be published in Young Ireland and the Irish Independent. Tickets are 6 each, by the way. It's a very considerable cost, actually.
And that's another one owns us.
The day's wages in those days.
Yes.
Mr. Thomas Ashe, Corduff and Luska. This is the Irish Volunteers, Oakland Maharan, and it's from Boomer Hobson, is it?
Yes.
Boomer Hobson from Antrim, the founder of the Irish Volunteers. Kindly let me know definitely at once the day and hour of the mobilisation of the Fingal Battalion, as the officers who are going down wish to make immediate arrangements. Amazing. The signature of Boomer Hobson on it.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
You know, it is, yeah. But look, just to give you, that's a small example of some of the material that we recovered, so which is we really appreciate
That's
and
really
delighted
great
with.
that you did
It is
that,
absolutely, yeah.
And PJ, memorabilia in your family is hAnnracháin and O'Kelly, because O'Kelly is central to Kildare story, really.
Well, the Kellys are Kildare story. The memorabilia, the family have been putting together, obviously, since the St. Henry. They've been collating a lot more and getting information. There's been information everywhere. It's been coming together now. So we hope to have much more. The museum in Carlow has a hAnnracháin room dedicated
Where it's going to see us.
So hopefully that is where eventually most of it will go.
Thank you. We're wrapping up. And
Just before I want to finish,
sure,
when you asked me what is that,
yeah, of course.
that's an important one, because that question hasn't been answered yet. So
Yes.
I haven't answered, but I'll give you my opinion.
Do
on
please.
it, because no one has answered that question.
Please,
Because he
Tom.
shouldn't have been shot, because he wasn't caught in the act of firing arms. He was in second in command nominee in Jacobs, but he fell down the stairs on the morning of going in, and of course, so therefore our friend John McBride were walking to the green, and he met Tom McDonough, and he brought him in and took over, which was the right, because he had experience in one-man ship. The reason why he was shot, I think, is two things. He was in number 2 Dawson Street. In number 2 Dawson Street, the volunteers, on the top floor you had O'Reilly in charge of armaments. In the second floor you had Bulmer Hobson in charge of administration, and in the back room you had Lawler in charge of all supplies. Every armament, and this is documented, I'm not saying it, every armament that went through Dublin, he consigned it. So people came from all over the world up to top 2 Dawson Street. He gave them a document and said, go to such a place and pick up arms and ammunition. And that's one of the reasons he was
Quartermaster.
I suspect he was earmarked. In the DNP G-Man's notes that were available now, coming available now, he is the person that's most noted. So therefore, there's no other one that was in the volunteers session that has more notation in their notes. Thirdly, he was a writer. In 1914, he published the Swordsman's Brigade. The reason he wrote the Swordsman's Brigade was that time in the Irish literary school system, all the storybooks were based on English army people going overseas. There was no mention of Irish. He wrote about an Irish soldier joining the wild geese, and that was the reason for it. Then he subsequently, after his execution, the family published When the Normans Came, and again that was about the Normans' invasion of Ireland and Wexford, and again that was in retaliation to George Richard Auckland, who was the local landlord in Wexford, who in 1911 had written this book on the Norman invasion. And what he stated was, the Norman invasion was essential for to bring rule and order to the unruly crowd in Ireland. All these tribes who were falling out, all the rest of it. And he said the British had continued that when they took over. So hAnnracháin wrote the Normans here as an answer naturally to that. Now, he was then, as we all know, taken into custody, marched up to Richmond Barracks, second in line for the court-martial, court-martialed and shot on Tuesday morning at dawn. 12 o'clock the night before, the officer commanding Kilmainham sends a card and a note up to his mother to say Micheál has been deported to Wakefield Jail in the morning for the family to go see him. The two sisters decided, Eileen and Anna decided the mother wouldn't be able to go down, so they went down. When they went down, they were told by the soldiers, he's for execution in the morning. Now, the mystery is how this, he was supposed to be for deportation, suddenly he's for execution, and so he was. So they brought him to the he's in a cell, and 67 is the number in the cell in Kilmainham, still there today. 67 is the Connaught Street where he lived. 67 has relations down to 1867. 67 reoccurs in that sequence. If you go into the Kilmainham jail and you ask for the head person there that brings around people to commit in jail. He will tell you about the hAnnracháin at 67. He's taken out and he's shot. Oh, sorry, before he's shot, therefore, the sisters ask, what about his affairs? They bring in a table on the candle, and he writes down and he says, I'm leaving all my books to my mother and my sister. And that's it. Next morning, he's shot. Finished. Now, in Whitby Hall, in that, there's a story in this which hasn't been told. This is about a family which hasn't really been brought together. It's in bits and pieces. But I reckon, James, maybe when you finish the book, there's a big story here that will bring all the pieces together. Because Harry, his brother, was behind him in all this, and he was a sort of Scarlet Pimpernel who was doing the running. And if you read Ned Bry's testimony in the ministry, you will see where all the information that came from Dublin Castle from 1917 to 1921 went through Pat Tracy, who was a cousin of Ned Bry's, who worked in Kingsbridge, then to 67, no, at that time they had moved to 384 North Circular Road through the O'Hanrahan household. And the reason I went there, at that stage they'd also taken on a bike shop. So it was legitimate to go there to have your bike repaired. So every bit of paper that went to Michael Collins at that stage went through the O'Hanrahans in so that is the story. So I reckon, now on a final thing, not to the labour, I said it to James already, Micheál O'Hanlon was a writer and would written, there's 2 books, and then there was a simple series of pamphlets which are available as well. But all his papers were taken by the British military when they raided the house after 16 and have never been found. There's only 2 pieces of paper that have been recovered. One was sold a month ago by Mealy's in Gaelic. It makes €1,200. And this is the other one. There's only 2 pieces of paper that have been found with Micheál O'Hanlon. So we reckon maybe there's a woman might stealing Q in plastic bags to be found. But that's the other one now, which is most unusual for a writer. So in other words, I think he's literary and his organisation ability more than his, let's say, military will cause.
Okay. Barry's coming in to finish this off, and Bradley's waiting for a picture. And I should leave this to Jerry to call, but next Wednesday in the GA Club we have a play by the Ardclough Youth Theatre called Blank, and it's a tremendous production. It was in Newbridge last week, and the only proviso it comes is it's by the Youth Theatre, but it's got language threshold guidelines, so not too young, the youths that come to it. And that's on next Wednesday, 8 p.m. All support appreciated in next door in the GA Club. Jerry, you're on.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I want to lay sincere thanks. Somebody said we have a duty to our heritage and we have a duty to history. And I thought it was expressed tonight so sincerely and emotionally. I understand I spent 40 years in the Defence Forces, so this topic and this subject is very close to my heart, I must say. Apologies from our chairman, John Griffin, who can't make it tonight, so I was subbed up to do this role. But what a mine of information. They say it's God manners to the point. What a mine of information. PJ and James and all the Ashes, thank you very much. It's so close, it's so real, it's 200 yards away, and we have a duty to remind ourselves and our neighbours and our offspring of it, you know. So I won't go on. I think we have to make it a cup of tea for some. Jim Tanker kindly donated, I don't think we've
done from Brian McCabe.
From Brian McCabe, they are 1916 British Cross little badges. So we you can give them out. I don't think there's enough room in the audience.
I will hold them the car.
We have to pay. We're not going around with the red basket or the blue basket, but we have to pay for the light bill and the heat and all again. So the little box outside, the contribution will be appreciated. And if people want refreshments, you're more than welcome to go across to the GA Club. But again, a sincere thanks. I'd love to spend a few more hours here. Just most interesting. Thank you.